Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the very first episode of the Voluntary Planet podcast. I am your host, Tad Soyland, and today I'm going to be showing a presentation on some of the fundamental aspects of anarchism or voluntarism. Those two terms are used synonymously by myself. Fair consideration, fair warning to anybody who might be listening to this who is not an anarchist. My presentation style is going to be at least slightly unapologetic, and therefore you might hear things that do not essentially comport to your current worldview if by chance you are somebody who believes in the existence of government. But nonetheless, I think you should stick around and see, and at the very least, learn what the essential worldview of an anarchist looks like. So without further ado, let's enter into the presentation. This presentation is entitled Anarchy, Chaos, or Freedom, presented by yours truly. So the very first slide here is what's called the Teachability Index, right? So what it essentially shows is the where you want to be if you're trying to learn the most about anything that you're researching. So on this left side of this bell curve, we have what I like to call the dismissive modality. And so people who reside on this side of the Teachability Index essentially are people who are more likely than not, or who are more likely to dismiss information that's being presented to them rather than accept it. And the extreme of this is arrogance, right? Anybody who's arrogant, who already thinks that they know everything that there is to know and that there's nothing that anybody can show them or teach them is anything that they don't know already, is going to be in a very poor position to learn anything that's being presented to them. And so then on down the line, you have somebody who's cynical, who's learning a little bit more, than somebody who's skeptical, still more, and then the teacher learns the most out of somebody who's in this modality, but also doesn't learn nearly as much as if they are also acting at the same time in a sort of student modality. And so this other side is what I like to call the submissive modality. And what the submissive modality is, as you can see, is somebody who's in the submissive modality is somebody who's more likely to accept information without necessarily filtering said information. And then obviously the extreme of that is somebody who's in a state of naivete or a naive person. So if you're a naive person, you're in a poor position to learn, obviously, just as the person who's arrogant, because on the opposite end, if you're somebody who's naive, you are just going to accept all of the different information that's being thrown at you without employing the proper sort of filtration as is necessary in order to come to the correct conclusions about what it is, the information that you are being presented with, right? So the best position to learn by far is by being somebody who's simultaneously a teacher and a student. So you know what you know, but you also know that you don't know everything, and you're willing to learn and you're open-minded, right? And so the reason that this is the first slide of this presentation is because it's very important in order to actually glean something from being presented with this information. If it is your first time being presented with it, because otherwise, if you think that anarchy is chaos and there's nothing that anybody can tell you to go against that, then you're not going to learn anything new, and there's no point in watching. You might as well just shut the show off right now. But anyways, please stay. So perceptions, right? So when most people are presented with the word anarchy, their minds automatically conflate it with chaos, unrest, and disorder. Memories of mob violence like that which happened in the summer of 2020 or the LA riots in 1992 fill their subconscious, and they believe that those violent and immoral rioters dressed in all black with bandanas covering their faces, throwing bricks through cafe windows, and setting cars on fire are the essence of the word. This is not true. And this presentation is intended to be a brief synopsis or a general crash course on true anarchism and the underlying epistemological underpinnings and principles which shape the belief structures of its adherents and its advocates. That's exactly right. This is the entire point of this very first episode, and it's hopefully going to lay the groundwork for all future episodes by showing essentially what this philosophy is all about. And obviously I'm not going to be able to go into all of the principles, all of the philosophy behind it, because that would take a very, very long time. But I'm going to try to highlight some of the major points of the philosophy. So, all right, let's get back into it. The title of this slide's programming. The average go-along to get-along person considers the absence of government to be the furthest thing from freedom and a healthy society. This is because most people are programmed from a very young age by government-funded public education, mass corporate media, society at large, and oftentimes their own families to believe that having certain individuals in a society bestowed with designation of authorities is a fundamentally necessary part of a functioning and orderly society, and that without the bestowment of extra rights to these certain individuals, disorder and human suffering is inevitable. The belief in government. The opposite of anarchism is archanism or statism. Statism is the belief in the existence of rulers and or government. It is a belief based on the presupposition that it is not only possible, but necessary and prudent for some individuals in a society to acquire and exercise certain rights that the rest of the population do not have, i.e. lawmaking, taxing, declaring and or waging war, confiscating property, arresting people, etc. Anarchists do not view any such rights as being legitimate, as the anarchist worldview is based on the conclusion that all rights are universal. Every person that has ever lived, lives now, and ever will live has the same rights as every other person. Nobody has the power to create rights that do not exist, and no one can delegate rights onto anyone else that do not inherently exist on their own. And here on the right side, we have a wonderful meme. It's called statism, the brilliant idea that we give a small group of people the right to kidnap, steal from, and kill us so that we can be protected from people who kidnap, steal from, and kill us. So, like I said, I'm essentially being unapologetic with the presentation. You are listening to somebody who's presenting anarchism from an anarchist lens. These are the critiques of modern society, of history that anarchists have, and call it what you will. I might be biased, but nonetheless, I believe what I'm presenting here is true nonetheless, and truth should never be spoken in a reserved tone of voice, in my opinion. So continuing, the divine right of kings. What is the divine right of kings? Well, throughout human history, societies have elected to create different kinds of ruling classes for different reasons. These reasons range from ideas that most people now believe are antiquated and illegitimate, two ideas that are still considered morally and ethically legitimate by the majority. Thankfully, most people consider things like the divine right of kings, which is the idea that kings have the right to rule because God gave them that right, to be illegitimate. But humanity at large has yet to realize the illegitimacy of other modern justifications for the state's existence. Right? So the divine right of kings, essentially what we still have in what people in England still believe, is that there are things such as royal bloodlines and people who have the right to rule over everybody else and declare things over everybody else, whether they'd agreed to them or not, simply because a deity, a god, came down and bestowed them with that right. And, you know, it's like I said in that slide, it's essentially obvious for the vast majority of people now, thankfully, that that's a load of crap. Like that there's no legitimate proof that these people who consider themselves to have the divine right to rule, that they indeed have been endowed with such a right by the God of creation or any such deity. Right, so that's a positive. Democracy. Democracy is the most popular form of government. It is based on the idea that by having elections wherein society chooses a ruling class based on a majority vote, that all of the actions then taken by that ruling class are therefore lawful, legal, and legitimate. Anarchists reject this idea at a fundamental level because they realize that objective morality does not change, even if most people seemingly agree that something is morally legitimate when it isn't. They also realize that there's ample evidence throughout history to show just how wrong, counterproductive, and downright dangerous and anti-human the fruits of this ideology really are. And we have a very nice meme again here on the right side. It says, democracy is the means by which those who adore authority and crave the security of servitude can use their superior numbers to enslave those of us who wish to be free. Very true, in my estimation. The very basis of democracy is mob rule. It is literally the idea that if you get a majority of people that believe in any sort of ridiculous notion, and regardless, I mean, of course, they always use the excuse of, well, you also have to respect minority rights, yeah, even though every single time that anything's voted upon or any such government is instituted, it always ends up destroying the rights of the smallest minority, which is the individual. But these people always, the people who are pro-democracy always justify everything it is that their sort of system of governance does by, well, most people agree that this is okay and therefore it is, it's just nonsense. So anyways, back to the presentation. Humanity must rid itself of the idea that democracy is in any way a moral or preferable societal modality. It is not, and history is full of examples to prove this. And those who place their trust in democracy often console themselves with the thought that they are the government and that they have some level of control over the things that governments do through the rituals of voting and elections, like I said a minute ago. Most of these people do not understand the futility of participating in a system whose long-term results are always and invariably, I put some emphasis on this because it is true. You can't point to me any government throughout history where this isn't the case, where invariably every single time you set up a government, whether it's democratic, whatever, it always ends up increasing in power. And that is one of the biggest reasons why I'm an anarchist, and how I arrived at the anarchist conclusion is I found out that, and I used to be a minarchist, by the way, person who believes in minimal government. I realized that minarchism is an oxymoron. There is no such thing as minimal government. It always grows. It's literally a cancer. So, anyways, most of these people do not understand the futility of participating in a system whose long-term results are always and invariably an exponential increase in state power and an inevitable decrease in the rights of the individual. And here we have some more memes to go along with that. Voting, the suggestion box of slaves, here by Lysander Spooner, a very good author. A man is no less a slave because he is allowed to choose a new master once in a term of years. And of course, the famous George Carlin quote, "If voting changed anything, it would be illegal." Moving on. Here's one of my favorite quotes by Larkin Rose. Democracy is bad? Well, what about republics? Well, as a friendly reminder, all of the worst tyrannies in history were democratically elected constitutional republics. If you don't believe me, go look up the constitutions of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or the People's Republic of China, or the Democratic People's Republic of North Korea, or the Weimar Republic, which became Nazi Germany. You will see that they all allowed people to vote and all had the equivalent of a Bill of Rights. No, there is nothing legitimate and nothing special about having a ruling class in the form of a constitutional republic. I think that speaks for itself. I think Larkin's right. No. Taxation. Society's condition is rife with the pathological worldview that it is acceptable for some groups of people to use violence against everyone else under taxation and law enforcement. While most people consider these things to be normal and prudent, in reality, they are nothing more than euphemisms for extortion and slavery. No amount of justification can change the act of violently forcing people to obey unjust laws or political dictates into something that is moral. All taxation is theft, no matter how much is taken and what it is used for. And here we also have a very pertinent meme that asks a very important question. Slavery. If stealing 100% of the product of someone's labor is slavery, at what percentage is it not slavery? If there's any meme or any image in this entire presentation that I wish the viewers will remember, in case they are not anarchists, is this one. And I want any of the viewers who are watching this right now to ask themselves that very question. Just saying. All right, the social contract. This is a big one, right? So, one of the most egregious deceptions that the adherents of the religion of government use to justify the imposition of man's laws is the idea known as the social contract. Social contract theory is essentially based on the idea that by being born in a specific geographic location, you automatically and implicitly consent to all of the contrived laws and regulations that the specific ruling class that reigns over that specific area has generated. This perhaps is the greatest of all the pervasive lies that can constitute the foundation of the belief in authority. It is also the greatest perversion of the concepts of consent and contract. Now, what are the concepts of consent and contract? Contracts are only ever valid if both parties mutually consent to the conditions stipulated within them. Right? You cannot go out and sign a contract with somebody stipulating that some other person who's never seen the contract, who you've never given the contract, and then automatically assume once that contract's signed that that other person is okay with it, because that would never fly. Nobody would think that that's legitimate in any other situation, but everybody who believes in government believes that the social contract is legitimate, even though it's based on the same principle that you can't involve other people in a contract if they don't see the contract, if they don't actually agree to it. But anyways, the definition of consent is when a person voluntarily and consciously agrees to a proposal or desire of another. The key word in this definition is the word voluntarily. The essence of government and what differentiates it from all other legitimate forms of organization is that it is based on the diametrical opposite of voluntary interaction, which is coercion. Therefore, all claims of legitimate, all-encompassing social contracts justifying the existence of government are false and based in moral relativism. All of that is exactly true. The reason that anarchists do not view government as being legitimate is because everything that government does from its foundation is based on coercion. All of it, all the way it makes money, the way it imposes its rules on everybody else, everything is based on coercion. And anarchists do not agree with coercion. So, moral relativism, what is it? The ideas and attitudes that are the absolute antitheses of anarchism, and those which are simultaneously the fertile ground in which the aspects of the belief in authority are rooted in, are the ideas of solipsism and moral relativism. What is moral relativism? Moral relativism is the ideology, or religion rather, that objective morality does not exist inherently in nature, and that right and wrong are subjective constructs which human beings may invent and arbitrate according to time, location, circumstance, or preference. In truth and reality, morality is objective. Rights can never become wrongs, and wrongs can never become rights at any place or time, regardless of how many people believe or wish for it to be so. That is, I think, one of the most important aspects of anarchism. And I understand that there's a lot of people who call themselves anarchists who are indeed moral relativists, and all kinds of other interesting people like Satanists and all of that who say they believe in anarchism, but at the same time they don't think there's a objective morality, which true, real anarchists, in my estimation, actually do believe in, and is the foundational foundational aspect of the philosophy, because that is what actually allows them to ascertain why it is that humanity must be free, and the reason why government is immoral. Because otherwise, if you have moral relativism, you have no basis for ascertaining those facts. Solipsism. What is solipsism? Solipsism is the ideology or religion that only one's mind is sure to exist. Solipsists contend, and again, these two things go together. Solipsism and moral relativism. That's why they're in the same on the same slide. Solipsists contend knowledge of anything outside one's own mind is unsure. Hence, there is no such thing as objective truth, and nothing about the external world and its workings can actually be known. Truth does exist, it can be known, and the reason for our existence is to find it and align ourselves with it. That is exactly true. The fundamental axiom of the solipsist is inaccurate. And anybody who considers themselves an anarchist and at the same time a solipsist is kidding themselves. Okay, the belief in authority. What is the belief in authority? Most of the social disorder and human suffering has been caused not by man's defiance of its laws, but by compliance with them. All major mass slaughters of humans committed by other humans throughout history have been committed in the name of man's law. The belief in authority is the schizophrenic idea that without government and its laws, humanity would invariably experience the same hellish chaos that has historically happened as a direct result of the existence of government and its rule of law. This is nothing more than conjecture based on the presupposition that no forms of social organization based in voluntary interaction could ever be better than those which are established currently or those that have existed in the past, no matter how dark and anti-human those provably are or have been. I don't know how much more impactful I could have written this sentence, but I feel like it strikes at the core of the belief in authority, in that people who are afraid of the concept of a world without government simply don't understand and don't have a holistic view of history enough so that they could see how provably horrific things have been with government. And so anyways, this is exactly what Larkin-Rose mentions in this beautiful quote. Note the drastic contrast between the usual connotations of those terms. Anarchy sounding scary and violent, and law and order sounding civilized and just, and the real world results of following conscience versus following rulers. The level of evil committed by individuals acting on their own is completely dwarfed by the level of evil committed by people obeying a perceived authority. Couldn't say it better myself. Very, very, very accurate statement, and hits at the core of the issue. So there are lots of, let me go back to, there are lots of different issues that people have whenever the topic of anarchism gets brought about. People constantly have all sorts of different explanations and ways as to how people can't live in freedom because there's all these different things that will result and that are all negative, and that ultimately people can't be their own rulers, and people can't live in freedom because people aren't perfect and people aren't angels, even though that's the proof. That same argument is the proof as to why we can't have government. But anyways, but without government, warlords would take over. This is a common one that you hear. One of the most common objections to the existence of a free society is the notion that in the absence of government, people would act in the utmost egregious and violent ways towards each other. Warlords, violent gangs, corporations run amok, and sociopathic individuals acting on their own accord would endlessly wreak havoc on society at large, and that nobody would keep them in check. This schizophrenic and historically illiterate notion completely ignores human history and the underlying causes for why history has thus far been filled with instances of mass genocide, holocausts, human slavery, and orchestrated mass starvation. And this quote right here that I'm about to read is the most important quote and my favorite quote of Dr. Robert Higgs that addresses this point. Anarchists did not try to carry out genocide against the Armenians in Turkey. They did not deliberately starve millions of Ukrainians. They did not create a system of death camps to kill Jews, Gypsies, and Slavs in Europe. They did not firebomb scores of large German and Japanese cities and drop nuclear bombs on 2 of them. They did not carry out a great leap forward that killed scores of millions of Chinese. They did not attempt to kill everybody with any appreciable education in Cambodia. They did not launch one aggressive war after another. They did not implement trade sanctions that killed perhaps 500,000 Iraqi children. In debates between anarchists and statists, the burden of proof clearly should rest on those who place their trust in the state. Anarchy's mayhem is wholly conjectural. The state's mayhem is undeniably, factually horrendous. If there's any slide, any image in this entire presentation that carries the most weight, that I would that I would beg any of the viewers to remember, it is this one right here. This is the most important one out of all of them in this entire presentation. Here's another problem that some people have with the idea of anarchism. But without government, who would build the roads? Who would build the roads? It is a ridiculous notion that with all the technological advancement that we have seen over the past 2 centuries, even with the immense hindrances of centralized regulation and the absence of a truly free, self-regulating market, humanity would be incapable of building one of the oldest, simplest, and most useful of these technologies if it weren't for a centralized gang of criminals bossing them around and stealing their resources to pay for them. This is where the crux of the issue lies. Most people whose knee-jerk reactions to being presented with the idea of true freedom is, but who will build the roads, are guided in their concerns fundamentally by an illusion. They do not understand the essence of the state, which is that government never creates anything at all. Government only ever takes resources by violence or threat thereof, and then uses those resources how it sees fit, or however the system at the time deems necessary. Government has only ever acted as the unnecessary middleman for the procurement of common goods that would undoubtedly exist in even more abundance than they do now if there was no centralized monopoly on violence acting as a proverbial bureaucratic roadblock, pun intended. That is absolutely true, and it's very unfortunate that people can't see it, and it's kind of bizarre how it's always the default, seemingly always the default answer that people have, like automatically whenever the topic of anarchism comes about, is, well, who would build the roads? Because that's the first thing that comes to mind. That's probably the most beneficial thing that taxation ever pays for. And these people don't understand that the demand for having roads is still going to be there whether there is government or not. People are still going to need to get from A to B, right? So this meme addresses it very well. One of the most complex machines in human history, built by hundreds of companies, easy to repair in your own garage. And then you have a flat thing, far too complicated for anyone to try without the magic of government. Moving on. Legality versus objective morality. Legality is never a good marker of ethics, and it is seldom an accurate measure of morality. This is because man's law is based on the subjective whims, political interests, and ideological underpinnings of the people who write the laws and those who influence them. There is no need for humanity to have a subset of individuals who are usually the worst people society has to offer to declare for the rest of us what is right and what is wrong. Most people inherently understand, even if it's at a subconscious level, that the fundamental difference between what the fundamental difference between right and wrong behavior is. Only when they are duped into moral relativism do they begin to believe absurdities and commit atrocities. And this meme on the right here addresses it very well as well. People who helped slaves escape were breaking the law. Then people who caught and returned them were following it. That's exactly right. And it's not very hard to look into the lexicon of all the different laws that are currently in existence now and have existed in the past to show just how separated and just how wrong some of the laws have been throughout history. And that is one of the biggest issues when it comes to man's laws that there is that, you know, half the time there's ever a law that gets passed, it's written by somebody, it's written by a politician who does not represent true objective morality, far less so, and usually doesn't even represent the will of the majority of people, regardless of what that is. So, moving on, and this is a dark one, right? So these are the inevitable products of the belief in human authority and so-called law and order. This is what happens when the natural law rights of the individual are considered irrelevant or inconsequential by those who view themselves as the rightful arbiters of morality, who get to decide what is right and what is wrong based on their own subjective whims and then call it law. This is the inevitable consequence of the masses getting duped into hallucinating legitimacy to the dictates of a small group of individuals who want to become God instead of following the inherent laws of creation, otherwise known as natural law, that are the only legitimate boundary conditions within which society has an obligation to operate. That is absolutely correct. All of the major atrocities that we've seen throughout the existence of humanity, throughout the existence of all the different governments and regimes throughout history, all of those terrible things that have happened are directly attributable to millions and millions of people hallucinating legitimacy and believing that there's a certain group of individuals that have certain rights that the rest of the people don't have, and that they somehow have the right to dictate what is right and what is wrong and what people have to do and what people can't do, etc. And it always ends very, very badly for people. Always. Just keep that in mind. What is natural law? Natural law is the eternal, immutable, non-man-made, universal, binding, and immutable conditions that govern the consequences of the interactions of all sentient beings. It is the underlying basis for all anarchist principles and thought. All belief in human authority is in direct contravention to natural law. And all of man's laws, which happen to be in accordance with natural law, are redundant and unnecessary. And here on the right, we have a comparison between natural law and man's law. On the left, natural law, we have a law that is based upon truth and principles, which are inherent to creation, harmonized with due to knowledge and understanding, universal, existing and applying anywhere in the universe regardless of location. It's not okay to kill somebody here as much as it's not okay to kill somebody somewhere else, regardless of some imaginary borders or the change of laws or what have you. And natural law is eternal and immutable, exists and applies for as long as the universe exists, and it cannot be changed. Just as it was immoral for the Nazis to kill 6 million Jews, or however many they killed, it's immoral then as much as it's immoral now. Nothing's changed. And then we have man's law. Man's law is based upon dogmatic beliefs or constructs of mind, complied with due to fear of punishment instead of being harmonized with due to knowledge and understanding, like natural law. It differs in location based on the whims of legislators, otherwise known as moral relativism, and also changes with time based upon the whims of legislators as well. There are things that I can do sitting in this room right now in this specific geographical area that would be completely and totally and utterly illegal in other places on the planet. And that is nonsense. It is nonsense. It's nonsense according to anarchists, and it objectively is completely nonsensical, regardless of who you are, what your political ideology is, and what you've been duped into believing. And again, I apologize. I do not apologize for being straightforward with this presentation, because again, I believe that what I'm presenting is true. What are the principles of anarchism? The two most prevalent principles of anarchism, anarchist thought, are the non-aggression principle and the self-defense principle. The non-aggression principle stipulates that the act of initiating violence against others is morally wrong, which it is. And the self-defense principle says that if an act of violence has happened, or there is reason to believe that one will happen, the person who is being assailed has the right to employ whatever means necessary to defend him or herself and stop that act of aggression. This is also absolutely, objectively, morally true. If you are a human being and you are being assailed by another human being unjustly, and there's undue violence being done against you, you have the right to defend yourself. And you also have, like the non-aggression principle states, a moral obligation to not initiate violence, to not inflict harm upon others. And just these two rules alone are more than enough to create a society that's significantly better than what we've had and what we currently have right now. Just a side note there. All right, so moving on, what is the true meaning of the word anarchy? This is one that gets that is very misunderstood by the masses of people out there who think they know what anarchy means, but they don't, because the only time they ever heard it is when the news talks about different chaotic events that happen on the news. So what does it actually mean? Well, the true meaning of the word anarchy comes from the Greek prefix an, meaning without or the absence of, and the Greek noun archon, which means master or ruler. Anarchy does not mean without rules or chaos. Let me say that again. Anarchy does not mean without rules or chaos. It literally means without rulers, without masters, or in other words, no masters and no slaves. It is synonymous with freedom. The word anarchy is literally synonymous with freedom. And yet the vast majority of people who utter the word anarchy use it in a negative context and use it in a context that comports the exact opposite of the actual meaning of it. So that should be very eye-opening to anybody who has always believed that anarchy means chaos and now is just learning that it actually doesn't mean that. And should say something about our modern society. Anarchist factions. There are many anarchist factions that most people who consider themselves anarchists subscribe to. All of these factions can be considered hyphenated anarchists. All hyphenated anarchist ideologies are simply ideas that do more to trap the minds of their adherents in a modality of focusing on social preferences and dialectical differences instead of focusing on the core principles of anarchy itself in the true purpose and meaning of human freedom and the absence of slavery. That is why I consider myself a big A anarchist. Big A anarchists are anarchists who do not consider themselves any sort of, and do not identify with any sort of hyphenated anarchist ideology. The difference is that we focus primarily on the principle and on the most important theme of anarchism, which is human freedom. We do not focus on any one specific social preference or some sort of societal organization that we think would be the most optimal for us or for humanity in general. We simply realize, anarchists simply realize that humanity must be free by whatever means, and that, like those other principles that I mentioned and other things, that those are the rules, because again, anarchists believe in rules. Those are the rules that that humanity must abide by. So, like I said before at the beginning of the presentation, I consider anarchism to be synonymous with voluntarism. Now, what voluntarism is essentially the belief that, the stance rather, that all human interaction must be voluntary. And like those other principles that I just went into, that I just covered, that the initiation of violence is immoral and that people have the right to defend themselves if and when somebody initiates violence against them. But I do not restrict myself only to believing that voluntary interaction is the end-all be-all of true human freedom, of anarchism. Anarchism is a very simple yet very broad worldview or ideology. There's certain things that can happen in a society where simply the principles of non-aggression and of self-defense don't necessarily provide the proper foundation for dealing with these different things. It's, in other words, it's not the end all be all, right? So what should be more focused on, and what if people only took the time to focus on anarchism itself instead of being preoccupied with their own sort of version of anarchism, the world would, I think, be closer to an anarchist condition than it is now. But without further ado, let's go on the presentation. There's 5 questions, right? There's 5 questions that anybody who believes in authority should ask themselves. Number 1, is there any means by which any number of individuals can delegate to someone else the moral right to do something which none of the individuals have the moral right to do themselves? Number 2, do those who wield political power, presidents, legislators, etc., have the moral right to do things which other people do not have the moral right to do? If so, from whom and how did they acquire such a right? Number 3, is there any process, examples, constitutions, elections, legislation, by which human beings can transform an immoral act into a moral act without changing the act itself? Number 4, when lawmakers and law enforcers use coercion and force in the name of law and government, do they bear the same responsibility for their actions that anyone else would who did the same thing on his own? And number 5, when there is a conflict between an individual's own moral conscience and the commands of a political authority, is the individual morally obligated to do what he personally views as wrong in order to obey the law? And if not, why not? These are the 5 fundamental questions when, if asked and if addressed in a ideologically honest and intellectually honest way, should allow the person to arrive at the anarchist conclusion. Again, if they are being intellectually honest with themselves, which a lot of people don't like to be. And lastly, I want to leave whoever's watching this with the one of my favorite quotes of another one of my favorite quotes of Robert Higgs. If anarchists are idealists, they may simply be likened to someone who finds himself swimming in a cesspool, and rather than paddling around about looking for the area with the least amount of floating feces, seeks to climb out of the pool completely. That is absolutely right. We as anarchists simply want a better world, and it is very unfortunate that modern society tends to demonize anybody who considers themselves an anarchist because, well, most people don't understand what anarchism is, actually. And so that is one of the main problems that I see in the world, and that is the reason why I have decided to begin this podcast. In the future, I'm going to be doing all sorts of different things, like going over modern events, past historical events, seeing them through an anarchist point of view, sort of pulling them apart and seeing and dissecting different societal problems and how the philosophy of voluntarism and anarchism would help those out and create a better world, because ultimately that's what we need to do in these times. And also, in order to help that out, there's these 2 books right here. We have the Anarchist Handbook by Michael Malice. This is slightly more of a popular read. It was a bestseller, I believe, on Amazon when it first came out. That book essentially goes into all, well, not all, but 2 of the main sort of hyphenated anarchist factions, which is anarcho-capitalism and anarcho-communism, and sort of shows the early philosophers and early thinkers and their works within its chapters. It's just a bunch of works from a bunch of different anarchist thinkers. And this book right here, which is The Most Dangerous Superstition, which I attribute to the reason as to why I am ideologically in the place I am right now, meaning I'm a voluntarist and a capital A anarchist. This book essentially is perfect for anybody who still believes in government but is open-minded enough to see the explanation and the anarchist worldview through the lens of an anarchist. This is written by Larkin Rose, and Larkin Rose and Michael Malice both have very good YouTube channels where they post regularly. So thank you very much for watching this first episode of the Voluntary Planet podcast, and I hope to see you on the next one. Good night.